There are moments in life, rare, luminous, almost sacred, when time seems to soften at the edges, when the noise of the modern world dissolves, not with effort, but with a single breath, and you find yourself suspended in a space that feels both deeply ancient and intimately present. This is such a moment. Tonight you are arriving not at a destination of stone or geography, but at a threshold of consciousness, a place where memory and landscape merge, where the earth still hums with the resonance of stories older than written history, and where silence is not emptiness, but a form of communication all its own. So let us begin, slowly, gently, as one would approach a sleeping animal or a sacred fire. Close your eyes now, not to shut out the world, but to open your inner senses. Feel the weight of your body settle into the surface beneath you, whether it be a bed, a chair, or the cool ground of your imagination. Let your shoulders release their tension, your jaw unclench, your hands grow warm and heavy. With each inhalation, draw in calm. With each exhalation, let go of urgency. There is no hurry here, no deadlines, no expectations. Only the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own breath, your first and most faithful companion on this journey. Now, imagine the air around you shifting, not cold, not hot, but alive with a humid warmth that wraps around your skin like soft linen. You are standing in the heart of the Mesoamerican lowlands, in the deep embrace of a rainforest that has witnessed millennia. The hour is late, but the world is far from asleep. Above you, the sky is not a void, but a vast, breathing dome studded with stars that shimmer with a clarity impossible beneath city light stars that have guided farmers, priests, and poets for more than 2,000 years. Their light falls softly on the world below, revealing shapes not through sharp definition, but through gentle contrast. The curve of a hill, the silhouette of a distant ridge, the towering form of a single immense tree that rises like a pillar between earth and heaven. This is the Ceiba de Yaxche, the world tree, the axis around which the Maya understood existence itself. Its roots plunge deep into Xibalba, the watery underworld of shadows and ancestors. Its trunk stands firm in Cab, the earthly realm of humankind, maize, and ceremony. And its highest branches stretch into Can, the celestial domain where gods move among constellations, and the moon traces her silver path. Even now, centuries after the great cities fell silent, this tree remains not as a relic, but as a living witness. Its bark is rough under your fingertips, patterned with deep grooves that speak of storms survived and seasons past. Its scent is subtle, damp wood, moss, a faint hint of resin that rises like incense into the night. When the wind stirs, its broad leaves whisper in a language older than words, and for a moment you understand. You are not entering history. You are entering continuity. Around you, the jungle breathes. Listen not with your ears alone, but with your whole being. There is the low, resonant call of a tinamou, solitary and mournful, echoing from somewhere deep in the undergrowth. Then the sudden rustle of a peccary moving through fallen leaves. The rhythmic croaking of tree frogs, each species keeping its own tempo, layering sound into a symphony that has played uninterrupted since before pyramids touched the sky. And beneath it all, the almost imperceptible thrum of life in the soil, roots stretching, insects burrowing, mycelial networks transmitting signals in the dark. In the distance, a small fire glows not wild, but tended. Its light flickers against carved stones half buried in leaf litter, their surfaces worn smooth by rain and time, yet still bearing the faint traces of glyphs. A curling serpent, a glyph for maize, the symbol of a ruler's name now softened, but never erased. Smoke rises in slow spirals, carrying the sweet woody perfume of copal resin palm and the Maya tongue of fragrance, offered not to appease gods, but to open channels of communication between realms. This is not worship as conquest or supplication. It is dialogue, reciprocity, a daily act of remembrance. You begin to sense them not as ghosts, not as figures from textbooks, but as presences that linger in the texture of this place. A woman grinding maize on a metate, her hands moving in a rhythm passed down from her grandmother's grandmother. The steady scritch a lullaby for her sleeping child. A young man walking a narrow trail between nilpas, balancing a basket of beans and squash on his hip, pausing to read the sky before dawn. An elder sitting near the fire fingers tracing the lines on a bark paper codex, his voice low as he recounts how the hero twins outwitted the lords of death, not as myth, but as living instruction about resilience, wit, and the sacredness of laughter. The Maya world was never frozen in time. It was never a monolith of temples and sacrifice. It was a civilization of astonishing depth and diversity, over 30 distinct languages spoken across city-states that spanned from the highlands of Guatemala to the coasts of the Yucatan and beyond. It was a people who mapped the movements of Venus with precision unmatched in the ancient world, who conceived of zero not as absence but as potential, who understood time not as a straight line toward progress or decline, but as a series of interlocking cycles, each ending not in apocalypse but in renewal. And yet, for all its complexity, its foundation was profoundly simple: reciprocity with the living world. Maize was not a crop, it was kin, a gift from the gods that required care, gratitude, and ritual return. Rain was not weather, it was the tears of Chak, the rain god, invoked not with command, but with song, dance, and the sound of conch shells echoing across plazas. Knowledge was not hoarded, it was woven into cloth, painted on pottery, spoken in poetry, sung in lullabies, passed hand to hand like a warm tortilla fresh from the hearth. Tonight, we will not rush through centuries. We will not leap from battle to collapse. Instead, we will move as the Maya moved, with attention, with reverence, with patience. We will walk through villages before they became cities, feel the weight of limestone blocks shaped by hand, stand beneath star-filled skies where priests read destiny, the dance of planets, and witness how a civilization responded to drought, change, and the quiet unraveling of empires not with despair, but with adaptation, memory, and an unbroken thread of cultural continuity that pulses still in the voices of millions today. If you wish to share where you are listening from, if it is midnight in Tokyo, dawn in Nairobi, or the quiet hours before sunrise in Mexico City, know that your presence, your attention, becomes part of this story. Stories live not in isolation, but in exchange. And if you would like to return to this space, to walk with Socrates in an Athenian courtyard, to stand on the deck of a ship sailing the Silk Road, or to witness the slow rise of Babylon beneath desert stars, you are always welcome. This channel is not a museum. It is a hearth, a place where history is not dissected, but breathed. So now, let the firelight warm your face. Let the scent of copal settle in your lungs. Feel the earth beneath your feet, not as ground to be conquered, but as a body that holds memory in its bones. The night is deep, but not empty. The jungle is vast, but not indifferent. You are here, at the foot of the Ceiba, at the beginning of a story that has been waiting not for discovery, but for recognition. And as the last embers glow and the stars hold their vigil above, we begin not with the birth of a king or the raising of a pyramid, but with the world before dawn, the breath before the first word, the stillness before the first step, the warm darkness in which all great civilizations first dream themselves into being. The world does not begin with monuments. It begins with breath, with the slow, steady rise and fall of a chest resting on a woven sleeping mat beneath a thatched roof, with the quiet sigh of a mother adjusting a cotton blanket over her child's shoulder as the last embers of the hearth glow faintly in the center of the room, with the distant call of a howler monkey, not yet loud, but resonant deep in the chest, like the low hum of a drum wrapped in cloth carrying across the canopy as the night softens toward its end. This is the Maya world not as history remembers it, but as it lived, not in stone first, but in skin, in soil, in the shared warmth of hands, passing a gourd of water from one to another in the dark. You are standing just beyond the edge of a small settlement, no more than a dozen homes clustered around a central clearing, nestled into a gentle rise where the limestone bedrock slopes downward toward a seasonal wetland. The air is warm, but not heavy, a perfect balance held only in these hours before dawn, when the heat of the day has fully dissipated and the sun has not yet begun its climb. Every breath you take is layered with meaning. The damp sweetness of decaying leaves, the mineral tang of exposed limestone, the faint green sharpness of crushed shia stems left near the door from yesterday's harvest, and beneath it all, the soft, resinous perfume of copal still rising in delicate spirals from a small offering placed at the base of a young Ceiba tree last night. This smoke is not ritual in the way we think of ceremony today. It is continuity, a thread of scent linking tonight to last night to the night before, stretching backward through generations who understood that to send fragrance upward was to say quietly, we are still here. The homes around you are not built, they are grown. Their walls rise from the earth in gentle curves, formed from vertical poles of sapodilla or guanacaste, lashed together with lianas so supple they seem to breathe with the wind. Between them, a daub of clay, crushed limestone, and plant fibers, sometimes mixed with ash from ancestral fires, has been pressed by hand, smoothed not with tools, but with the flat of a palm, leaving faint impressions. The ridge of a knuckle, the curve of a thumb. These are not imperfections. They are signatures. The roof above is thatch layers of guano palm leaves, each one carefully selected for length and flexibility, bound in overlapping rows that shed rain like feathers shed water. The overhang extends just far enough to create a shaded threshold, a space neither inside nor out, where elders sit in the afternoon to shell beans, where children pause before stepping into the world, where stories are told not in bursts, but in long, unhurried arcs that match the setting sun. Inside one home, a woman lies awake. She is not anxious. She is attentive. Her right hand rests on her abdomen, not swollen yet, but changed, and her left hand traces the rim of a small ceramic bowl left beside her mat. It is cool to the touch, its surface glazed with a thin slip of iron-rich clay that catches the ember light in soft amber highlights. Inside, a spoonful of atole remains maize gruel, thickened overnight, its surface now lightly crusted, its flavor deepened by time. She does not eat it yet. She waits for the light, for the sound of her partner rising, for the moment when the first bird calls not from instinct, but from certainty that the day has truly begun. Her breathing is slow, deliberate. Each exhale carries the faint scent of achiote-dyed cotton, of wood smoke, of the earth floor beneath her packed hard over years, warm even in the cool hours, radiating the stored memory of yesterday's sun. Near the hearth, the fire is not dead. It is sleeping. A bed of coals glows beneath a fine layer of ash, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat under skin. To let it die completely would be to break the thread. Fire is not fuel. It is memory made visible. It is the first companion of humanity. Every morning, the same ritual. A pinch of dry grass, a few shavings of bark, a gentle breath, not a blow, but a gift of air, and the ember stirs, brightens, reaches upward. This is how the day begins, not with urgency, but with reciprocity. You give breath, it gives light. You give attention, it gives warmth. Outside, the world prepares without sound. A boy of 10 slips from his family's dwelling, barefoot, balancing a gourd dipper in one hand. He walks to the cholchun, a bell-shaped cistern, carved into the limestone, its interior sealed with stucco, its mouth covered with a woven palm lid to keep insects out. He lifts the lid. The air that rises is cool, still, and carries the clean scent of wet stone. He lowers the gourd slowly, listening for the soft glug-glug as it fills not to the brim, but just enough. The first water of the day is never wasted. It is drunk first, by the one who draws it not in greed, but in duty. A silent acknowledgement. I am part of this. I depend on this. I will not take more than I need. Then he fills 2 more gourds, one for the elders, whose joints ache when the humidity drops, one for the nursing mother, whose body gives more than it receives, and whose thirst is a quiet, constant presence. The scent of the pre-dawn air is not a single note, but a symphony in layers. Closest, the green bitterness of ramon leaves, torn by a night foraging peccary. Above it, the honeyed sweetness of plumeria blossoms, fallen during the night, now pressed into the earth near the path, their fragrance intensifying as the temperature rises. Beneath that, the sharp citrus resin aroma of copal not burning now, but lingering from last night's offering, its molecules still suspended in the cool air. And deeper still, almost imperceptible unless you pause, the metallic tongue of limestone, exhaled by the bedrock as it warms, molecule by molecule, in anticipation of the sun. Sound, too, arrives in waves, not noise, but texture. A kinkajou rustles in the canopy, its prehensile tail curling around a branch as it retreats to its daytime hollow. A pair of ocellated turkeys scratch in the leaf litter at the edge of the milpa, their iridescent green and blue feathers catching the faint ambient light like scattered shards of jade. High above, the wind stirs the upper branches of a cabbage palm, and the sound is not rustling, it is whispering, a dry, papery susurration, like pages turning in a book written long before glyphs were carved in stone. And then the milpa, not a field, a conversation. Rows of maize stand not in rigid grids, but in flowing arcs that follow the land's natural contours, minimizing erosion, maximizing sun exposure, honoring the shape of the earth rather than forcing it into obedience. Each stalk is part of a triad: ixim, maize, biu-ul, beans, kiang, squash. The maize rises tall, offering structure. The beans climb, spiraling upward, their roots hosting nitrogen-fixing bacteria in an invisible pact with the soil. The squash spreads wide, its broad leaves forming a living mulch-suppressing weeds, conserving moisture, shielding the earth from the midday blaze. This is not agriculture as domination. It is kinship farming, a recognition that survival is not extraction, but exchange. The land gives, the people return, the cycle deepens. Even now, in the dark, the milpa breathes. Dew gathers on the undersides of squash leaves, trembling, waiting for the first light to release it, as offering, as nourishment, as blessing. Inside another home, an elder grinds maize on a metate, not the flat grinding stones of later times, but a slightly concave slab of volcanic basalt, its surface worn smooth by decades of motion. Her mano, a handstone shaped by use more than design, moves in slow, steady circles. Push, rotate, lift. Push, rotate, lift. The sound is not harsh. It is rhythmic, meditative, a bass line to the night's final moments. The maize has been nixtamalized, soaked, and cooked in an alkaline solution of water and wood ash transforming it chemically, unlocking niacin, softening the hull, deepening the flavor into something warm, nutty, complex. Her granddaughter sits beside her, not grinding yet, but watching, absorbing the angle of the wrist, the pressure of the heel of the hand, the way the grandmother pauses every few rotations to wipe a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her forearm. A gesture that says this is work, this is love, this is how we continue. And then the light begins, not a flood, a seep. The eastern horizon softens from black to deep indigo, then to a bruised violet, then to a pale luminous gold that seems to rise from the earth itself. A single star Venus Chak-Ik, the great star, still burns fiercely, low and brilliant. To the Maya, this is no mere planet. It is Kukulkan's mirror. It is the herald of dawn and dusk. It is warrior and guide. Its presence at this hour is not coincidence. It is invitation. A man steps from his doorway and stretches his arms wide, not in yawn, but in alignment. He faces east. He does not pray to the sun. He receives it. His body becomes a sundial, a living instrument. He notes the angle of the first rays as they filter through the canopy, casting long, trembling shadows that stretch like fingers across the packed earth plaza. These shadows will shorten predictably. He knows this, not because he has clocks, but because he has watched, for years, for lifetimes. Time here is not measured in minutes, but in maize cycles, in rains, in the waxing and waning of the great star, in the subtle shift of light on stone. This is the foundation, not of empire, but of understanding. The Maya world was not built in a day of grand design. It grew slowly, deliberately, like roots seeking water in limestone. Every act, no matter how small, carried weight. The placement of a hearthstone, the pattern of thatch on a roof, the direction a doorway faced, the sound of grinding at dawn, all were threads in a vast, living tapestry of meaning. There were no ordinary moments, only moments woven with intention. A child stirs inside a home, fingers brushing the rim of a clay bowl left beside the sleeping mat cool to the touch, still holding the memory of yesterday's meal. A mother rises without sound, her bare feet pressing into the packed earth floor, already warmed by the lingering heat of the previous day's sun. A tapir moves through the underbrush, its hoofprints sinking softly into the moist loam. A brook murmurs over smooth stones, its voice constant, patient, a thread of sound that has run through this place longer than memory. And as the first true gleam of sun breaches the treetops, not a blaze, but a golden thread drawn across the sky, you understand. This civilization was never built in a single act of brilliance. It was grown, like maize, like vines, like life itself, slowly, tenderly, in the space between darkness and dawn. The day has not yet begun, but everything needed for it is already here. As the first light strengthens and the gold of dawn spreads across the forest floor, the world does not leap into action, but deepens into presence, as though the night's stillness had not ended, but merely changed its tone, shifting from the low hum of rest to the quiet resonance of intention. And in this subtle transition, the earliest stirrings of cultural life begin to take shape, not in declarations or monuments, but in the cumulative weight of repeated gestures, shared observations, and the slow crystallization of meaning around places that, over time, come to hold more than physical significance. At the heart of the settlement, the great Ceiba tree stands as it has for over 3 centuries, its trunk measuring more than 2 arm spans in girth, its bark deeply furrowed in vertical grooves that channel rainwater downward during the wet season and provide shelter for beetles, ants, and the tiny orchids that cling to its upper branches in dry months. This tree is not merely old, it is remembered, having stood through generations of births, droughts, harvests, and ceremonies, its roots penetrating deep into the limestone bedrock where they encounter ancient water-filled fissures, drawing moisture not from surface soil alone, but from subterranean rivers that flow in darkness beneath the village. And because of this, the Ceiba remains green even when surrounding trees shed their leaves in the dry season, its resilience marking it not as an object of worship, but as a living witness, a silent participant in the unfolding of human life. Its presence so constant that children learn to orient themselves by it before they learn to count, turning instinctively toward its broad silhouette when disoriented in the forest, knowing that home lies where its shadow falls longest at noon. The space around its base has been shaped not by design, but by convergence. People have gathered here so often, for so long, that the earth has compacted into a smooth, slightly raised platform, its surface cool to the touch even at midday, and around its perimeter, a ring of river stones, each no larger than a human hand, each rounded by centuries of water's patient work, has been placed not in a perfect circle, but in a shape that follows the natural curve of the largest buttress root, as though the community had chosen to echo the tree's own geometry rather than impose symmetry upon it. These stones are not decorative but functional, serving as seats during gatherings, their surfaces worn smooth by the friction of countless bodies settling into them. And over time, their arrangement has evolved. A new stone is added not by decree, but when someone brings one from the riverbank after a particularly meaningful conversation, placing it quietly at dusk without announcement, and if it remains undisturbed 3 moons, it becomes part of the circle, a silent record of continuity, of belonging, of shared memory made tangible in limestone and time. Offerings appear each morning not as ritual obligation, but as reciprocal exchange. A small cluster of white maize kernels, selected from the first harvest of the season, their starch still dense and sweet. A sprig of copal resin, sticky and fragrant, broken from a branch felled by wind the previous week. A single conch shell, its spiral echoing the shape of galaxies and whirlpools, carried from the coast over many days by a traveler who placed it here upon arrival as a gesture of gratitude for safe passage. These objects are not left carelessly, but arranged with deliberate asymmetry, never centered, never aligned, because symmetry belongs to the sky and the stars, while asymmetry belongs to the earth and to life, which grows in response to pressure, light, and chance. The placement of each offering reflects an understanding that the sacred is not in perfection, but in relationship, and that to give is not to sacrifice, but to affirm connection, to say, I am part of this, I depend on this, I will not take more than I return. Meanwhile, in the growing light, observation becomes practice. A hunter returns, not only with 2 peccaries slung over his shoulder, but with a detailed account of animal behavior, how the jaguar's tracks crossed, the deer path near the bayou, how the howler monkeys began their morning call 17 heartbeats earlier than on the previous day, how the flowering of the chaca tree has begun on its southernmost branches first, signaling that the rains will arrive within 20 days. These details are not anecdotes, but data points in a living archive, cross-referenced by elders who recall similar patterns from their youth and by priests who note the position of Venus at dawn, its brightness increasing each morning as it prepares to vanish into the sun's glare, a celestial event that, in ancestral memory, has often preceded seasonal shifts. The conversation that follows is not a report, but a weaving voices interlacing like threads on a loom, where one person adds the feel of the wind on the skin, cool and dry, carrying the scent of distant fires, another the taste of the well water, slightly sweet or no, indicating the limestone aquifers are full, and a third the behavior of fireflies the previous night, fewer than usual, suggesting the soil moisture is dropping in the eastern fields. In this way, knowledge is not stored in individual minds, but distributed across the community, held in the collective act of listening, and what emerges is not a prediction but a probability, a shared intuition about what the world is preparing to do, and how the people might move with it rather than against it. From this foundation, the first ceremonial spaces arise not as temples, but as clarifications of existing relationships. A naturally flat limestone slab, partially exposed by erosion, is selected not for its size, but for its thermal properties. It warms slowly in the morning sun and retains heat well into the afternoon, making it ideal for gatherings when the air is still cool. It is not carved or inscribed, but its surface is smoothed further by hand, using river sand and water until it feels like cool silk beneath the palms. Around it, people sit not in rows, but in a loose spiral, their bodies angled toward the center and toward one another, ensuring that no voice dominates and that eye contact flows freely, reinforcing the understanding that truth is not spoken from above, but discovered in dialogue. During full moons, stories are told here, not as entertainment, but as calibration, where the tale of the maize god's descent into Xibalba is recounted not to explain death abstractly, but to remind listeners that renewal requires surrender, that the seed must rot in darkness before it sprouts, and that grief, like drought, is not an enemy, but a season that must be endured with patience. The voice of the storyteller is never loud, never theatrical, but low and rhythmic, rising and falling with the breath. And when a child interrupts with a question, why did the twins cheat in the ball game? The elder does not silence them, but pauses, considers, and answers not with certainty, but with invitation. My grandmother told me they did not cheat, but redefined the rules, as we must sometimes do when the old ways no longer serve life, and perhaps you see it differently, thereby ensuring that memory remains alive, responsive, and rooted in inquiry rather than dogma. At the same time, artisans begin to shape objects that carry more than utility. A potter, seated in the shade of a thatched awning, presses her thumb into a coil of clay, gathered from the riverbank near the bayou, where the sediment is rich in iron and mica, giving the fired vessel a subtle golden shimmer when held to the light. She shapes the bowl not with tools, but with her hands, her fingers remembering the pressure her mother applied, her mother before her, stretching back through lifetimes. And as she works, she hums an old lullaby, whose rhythm matches the turning of the coil 3 presses forward. 1 lift, 2 presses back, a cadence that steadies her breath and centers her attention. When the bowl is leather hard, she scores its rim, not with uniform notches, but with irregular indentations, each one placed where her thumb naturally rested during shaping, so that the final form echoes the curve of the horizon at dawn, the swell of a pregnant belly, the arc of a thrown stone. After firing, the surface darkens unevenly, and in that variation she sees the pattern of clouds before rain, the ripple of wind across water, the fingerprint of time itself, and when the bowl is used to serve a tole at dawn, a drinker's lips touch the rim where her thumb pressed, creating a silent continuity between maker, object, and user, a chain of care spanning generations. Nearby, a weaver knots cotton threads dyed with indigo, harvested from annual plants grown in household gardens, and a natto from the seeds of the asiote tree, roasted and ground to release their deep orange oil, her fingers moving in a sequence passed down through touch rather than speech. The pattern she creates, zigzags intersecting circles, is not arbitrary, but reflects multiple layers of meaning. The zigzags mirror the path of lightning across the sky, which the Maya observe does not strike randomly, but follows lines of least resistance through the air, just as rivers find their course through the land. The circles represent the milpa fields viewed from above, the full moon, the pupil of the eye, and the cyclical nature of time. And the way the threads interlock without knotting symbolizes the ideal of community individual, strands retaining their integrity while contributing to a stronger whole. When the cloth is finished, it is not cut but left in a continuous loop, used as a faja, waistband, that supports the lower back during labor, its tension providing both physical relief and a tactile reminder of connection to the earth, to the ancestors, to the living community. Travelers arrive from neighboring settlements, not on wide roads, but along narrow trails that follow the natural contours of the land ridgelines that drain well, stream banks that offer fresh water, and forest edges that provide visibility and protection. And their arrival is not announced, but sensed. The slight change in bird calls as they approach, the faint scent of unfamiliar smoke clinging to their clothing, the rhythmic cadence of their footsteps, different from the local gait. They carry news not as urgency, but as offering, a new technique for reinforcing walls against heavy rains, interweaving flexible guano palm ribs with vertical posts to allow slight movement without collapse. A song from the highlands about the hummingbird and the storm, whose melody mimics the accelerating beat of rain on thatch before a downpour, and a pouch of seeds from a maize variety that ripens 15 days earlier than local strains, its kernels slightly smaller, but more resistant to weevils. Exchange is not transactional, but relational gifts are given without immediate return expected, because reciprocity is understood as a cycle spanning seasons, not a balance sheet settled in a single encounter. When a visitor departs, they are not simply sent off, but accompanied in memory. The host walks with them to the edge of the settlement, then places a small, unmarked stone on the trail as they leave, a silent marker that says you were here. Your words mattered. You are remembered, and if that stone remains in place for a full moon, it is covered with soil and a Ramon seed is planted beside it, so that the memory grows into a tree, its roots intertwining with the path, its fruit feeding future travelers. And always, the Ceiba remains not as a symbol, but as a living interface between realms. Its canopy hosts epiphytes whose roots capture fog and release it as drip water during dry spells, sustaining insects, frogs, and birds. Its trunk shelters colonies of ants that protect it from herbivores in exchange for nectar. Its roots, spreading outward in broad, smooth curves, penetrate deep into the limestone, where they encounter mycorrhizal fungi that form vast underground networks connecting it to surrounding trees, allowing the exchange of nutrients, chemical warnings, and even carbon, what modern science calls the wood wide web, but what the Maya understand as K, the breath of the forest, the slow pulse of shared life. To lean against the Ceiba is not metaphorical, it is physiological. The vibration of sap rising through its xylem can be felt as a faint tremor in the palms, the same frequency as a resting human heartbeat. And elders who sit with their backs to the trunk for long periods report a subtle syncing of their breath with the tree's rhythm, a phenomenon they describe not as mysticism, but as kai-slimal, co-breathing, the recognition that life is not solitary, but interwoven at the level of pulse and pore. By the time the sun reaches its zenith and the shadows shrink to narrow lines beneath the dwellings, the foundation of something profound has been laid not in stone, but in attunement, a worldview in which humans are not masters of the earth, but participants in a vast, breathing conversation, where observation is devotion, memory is responsibility, and every act grinding maize, placing a stone, telling a story, is a stitch in the fabric of continuity. The villages are still small, the temples had not yet risen, but the inner architecture is forming, a civilization that will one day map the stars, carve time into stone, and build cities that rise like mountains from the jungle, yet never forget that all of it began here, in the hush beneath a single tree, listening not for voices, but for resonance, for the quiet certainty that to belong is not to dominate, but to respond. As the seasons turn and the slow wheel of the solar year completes its arc once more, a subtle but irreversible shift begins to settle across the Maya landscape, not as a rupture, but as a deepening, like the way a river gradually carves its channel over centuries, not through force, but through persistent presence. And in this quiet transformation, the small clusters of homes that once nestled lightly against the forest floor begin to gather weight, not only in number, but in meaning, as families choose to remain rather than disperse, as elders decide to rebuild on the same foundations rather than seek new ground, and as children grow up knowing no other horizon than the one framed by the Ceiba's branches and the rising silhouette of the communal platform. This is not urbanization as conquest or ambition imposed from above, but as convergence, a slow magnetism of trust, memory, and shared rhythm that draws people together with the same inevitability that roots seek water in limestone. And what emerges is not a city in the modern sense, but a center of resonance, a place where human life begins to echo with greater complexity without losing its connection to the pulse of the earth. The change begins in the ground itself literally. Where once homes rested on simple earthen floors, packed smooth by bare feet over years, now layers of marl and crushed limestone are brought in baskets from nearby quarries, carried on the backs of men and women who move in steady procession from dawn until the light grows long, their breath rising in soft clouds as they tamp each layer with wooden mallets until the surface becomes firm, cool, and slightly reflective, holding the memory of rainfall without turning to mud. And this new foundation does more than support walls. It signals intention, a decision to stay, to invest time not just in survival, but in permanence. And as these platforms rise first only knee-high, then waist-high, their edges are shaped not with rigid geometry, but with flowing curves that echo the natural contours of the land, as though the builders had studied the way water moves after rain and decided to let the earth guide their hands rather than impose straight lines upon it. Atop these platforms, the homes themselves evolve. Wooden posts give way to stone bases carved from local limestone, their surfaces left rough-hewn, not out of haste, but out of respect for the stone's own character. And the walls, still woven from reeds and cane, are now coated with a finer daub, mixed with crushed shell and fine ash, giving them a pale, luminous quality that catches the low light of dawn and dusk like the surface of a calm lagoon. At the heart of each growing settlement, the communal space expands with deliberate care, not as a plaza imposed by decree, but as a clearing that widens organically, shaped by the paths worn by countless footsteps, converging toward the Ceiba, the fire pit, the grinding stones, and the small altar where offerings are placed. This space is not paved, but prepared. The soil is raked smooth each morning by children assigned the task as part of their learning, not as labor, but as ritual, and as they work, they are taught to notice the color of the earth after rain, the way certain plants grow only in the compacted areas near the fire, the subtle depression where the elders always sit, worn deeper with each passing season, and in this daily act of tending, they absorb the knowledge that community is not inherited, but maintained, renewed with each generation's attention. When gatherings occur, people do not sit on benches or stools, but on low mounds of earth built up over time, where bodies have rested, each one slightly different in height and curve, conforming to the shape of those who came before, so that to sit there is to feel, quite literally, the imprint of ancestry beneath you, a physical continuity that needs no words to be understood. The first true ceremonial platforms rise not from sudden inspiration, but from accumulated necessity. As more people gather for planting rites, harvest blessings, and star-reading nights, the need for elevation becomes apparent, not for dominance, but for visibility and acoustics, so that the voice of the elder, recounting the maize god's descent, can be heard by all, and so that the alignment of the rising sun on the equinox can be marked clearly against the horizon. These early structures are built without mortar, their stones fitted together through patient trial and adjustment, each block tested, rotated, tapped into place with wooden mauls, until it settles with a soft thump that signals harmony, not force, and the builders work not in silence, but in shared rhythm, their movements synchronized by the cadence of breath and the occasional low hum that helps them lift heavier stones, a sound that blends with the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, so that the act of construction becomes itself a form of prayer, a physical meditation on balance, weight, and interdependence. Daily life adapts to this growing density with remarkable grace. Paths that once wound loosely between homes are now bordered with low stone curbs, not to confine, but to channel rainwater away from doorways and toward communal gardens. And these curbs are lined with chaya and asioti plants, useful, beautiful, and spiritually significant, their red seeds and green leaves offering both nourishment and color, while their roots stabilize the soil. Water management evolves as well. Simple gourds give way to ceramic vessels with narrow necks and wide bases, designed to minimize evaporation and prevent contamination. And these are stored not inside homes, but in shaded niches built into the platforms, where the limestone keeps them cool even at midday, and where their arrangement, largest at the back, smallest near the front, forms a silent inventory that any visitor can read at a glance, a nonverbal language of sufficiency and care. Even waste is woven into the system. Ash from the hearth is saved not for disposal, but for nixtamalizing maize and for whitewashing walls. Organic scraps feed the chickens and pigs kept near the forest edge, and broken pottery is crushed and mixed into new daub, so that nothing is lost, only transformed, a material echo of the cosmic belief that death is not an end, but a change of state, like maize rotting in the dark before it sprouts. Leadership, too, evolves not into hierarchy, but into responsibility distributed. The man who knows the stars best does not command, but advises. The woman who remembers the oldest planting songs does not rule, but teaches. The elder who mediates disputes does not judge, but listens until a resolution emerges from the group itself, like water finding its level. Decisions about when to clear new fields, how to respond to a dry spell, or whether to welcome a traveling family, are made not in closed councils, but in open circles, where silence is as valued as speech, and where a child's question, "Why do we always plant beans beside the maize?" can pause the discussion long enough for the group to revisit its own assumptions, a practice that ensures knowledge remains alive, responsive, and rooted in inquiry rather than dogma. This is not democracy as voting, but as attentive coexistence, a system that values patience over speed, depth over efficiency, and continuity over novelty. Artisans respond to this expanding world by deepening their craft. Potters begin to shape vessels not only for utility, but for ceremony bowls with slightly flared rims that catch the first light of dawn, jars with narrow waists that fit perfectly in the crook of the arm when carried from the cholchun, and effigy vessels shaped like frogs or bats, their forms not decorative but mnemonic, reminding users of the rainy season or the night's protective spirits. Weavers introduce new motifs into their textiles, not abstract patterns, but representations of the world as they understand it. Zigzags for lightning and rivers, concentric circles for the sun and the milpa, stepped triangles for the emerging platforms, and interlocking spirals for the Ceiba's roots and the Milky Way, so that to wear such a cloth is to carry the cosmos on one's shoulders. And carvers, working with stone and bone, begin to etch subtle symbols into tools and ritual objects, not glyphs yet, but proto-signs. A spiral for breath, Ko, a dot within a circle for the seed, a wavy line for water, each one a seed of writing, planted in clay and stone long before it blooms into script. Trade intensifies not through markets, but through reciprocity networks. A family from the highlands arrives bearing obsidian blades, their edges sharper than any flint, and in return they are given dried ramon seeds, prized for their protein and their use in ceremonial drinks. A group from the coast brings salt and conch shells, and leaves with woven cotton and stories of a new technique for reinforcing walls against hurricanes. These exchanges are never hurried, never transactional in the modern sense. Goods are offered, accepted, and reciprocated over days, woven into shared meals, songs, and storytelling sessions, so that the objects themselves become carriers of relationship. Each obsidian blade holding the memory of the hands that mapped it, each conch shell echoing the sound of distant waves in the mind of its new keeper. And as these connections multiply, a shared cultural grammar begins to form, not enforced, but absorbed, like the way children learn to speak by listening, so that a potter in one valley and a weaver in another, though they have never met, understand the same symbols, tell the same variants of the hero twins story, and time their planting by the same celestial signs. Most profoundly, time itself begins to be felt differently, where once the day was marked by the position of the sun and the calls of birds. Now the rising platforms create new horizons' edges against which the sun's movement can be measured with greater precision, and priests, standing on these elevated surfaces at dawn, begin to note not just that the sun rises, but where it rises, tracking its slow migration north and south along the eastern ridge over the course of the year. And from these observations, the first calendrical concepts emerge not as abstract numbers, but as embodied knowledge. The number of days between the sun rising over the Ceiba's tallest branch and over the jagged rock to the north becomes a unit of time. The interval between the first flowering of the chaka and the arrival of the rains becomes a season, and the reappearance of Venus in the morning sky after its 8-day disappearance becomes a sacred interval, a heartbeat of the cosmos that priests mark not with ink, but with memory, repetition, and song. This is the birth of Maya timekeeping, not in observatories, but in the body's alignment with earth and sky, in the daily act of standing still and noticing. By the time the dry season returns, and the forest glows gold in the low afternoon light. The transformation is undeniable. What were once villages are now cities in embryo, not defined by size alone, but by density of meaning, by the layering of gesture upon gesture, memory upon memory, until the land itself begins to hum with the quiet electricity of shared intention. The jungle has not been conquered. It has been invited in, its vines allowed to drape over the lower platforms, its birds nesting in the thatch, its animals moving through the outskirts with cautious familiarity. And the people do not see this as encroachment, but as coexistence, a recognition that the city is not separate from the forest, but a concentration of it, a place where human life gathers to listen more deeply, to remember more faithfully, and to respond more wisely to the great, slow breath of the world. And as the evening fire is lit in a central clearing, its glow reflecting in the eyes of children and elders alike, you can feel it, the first quiet certainty that something enduring is being built here, not in haste, but in harmony, stone by stone, story by story, breath by breath, beneath the watchful branches of the Ceiba. As the first true cities of the Maya world settle into their rhythm, a new kind of silence begins to emerge, not the silence of absence, but the silence of deep concentration, like the quiet held in a craftsman's hands as he shapes something that must outlast him. And in this stillness, the jungle itself seems to lean in, listening, as stone begins to rise among the trees with the same inevitability that roots seek water in the limestone bedrock. The change is not sudden, nor is it imposed. It unfolds gradually, like the unfurling of a new leaf after rain, guided by hands that have learned, over generations, to read the land not as raw material, but as a partner in creation. And the first temples do not appear as declarations of power, but as affirmations of relationship between earth and sky, between memory and time, between the living and those who walked before. These early structures begin as broad earthen platforms, built layer by layer with soil carried in woven baskets, each load lifted onto the growing mass with a soft thud that echoes across the clearing, not as noise, but as punctuation in the day's rhythm. And as the platform rises, stones are brought from nearby outcrops, not dragged, but carried in pairs, their weight distributed across shoulders, padded with folded cotton, their surfaces still rough with the marks of the quarry, cool to the touch even at midday, and when they are laid into position. No mortar is used, only patience, as builders test each stone against its neighbor, rotating it slowly, tapping it with wooden mauls until it settles with a low, resonant click that signals harmony rather than force, a sound so subtle it can only be heard by those kneeling close, their ears tuned to the language of balance. The limestone itself is not inert, it breathes, formed over millions of years from the compressed skeletons of ancient sea creatures. It holds within its matrix the memory of oceans long vanished, and when freshly cut, its surface glistens with microscopic crystals that catch the low light of dawn like scattered stars. Artisans learn to read its grain, knowing that some blocks fracture cleanly along natural planes while others resist, demanding a different angle of pressure, a slower rhythm of percussion. And in this dialogue between hand and stone, a new form of knowledge emerges, not written, not spoken, but embodied in the calluses on the palms, in the tilt of the wrist, in the way a builder pauses to let the vibration of the last strike fade before lifting the next stone. As the platforms grow taller, their surfaces are smoothed not with metal tools, but with river stones and water, rubbed in slow circles until the limestone takes on a soft sheen, pale and luminous, like the inside of a seashell. And when the sun reaches its zenith, this surface reflects the light not harshly but gently, casting a warm glow onto the faces of those who gather below, as though the architecture itself were participating in the act of blessing. Alignment is not geometry for its own sake, it is cosmology made visible. Priests and builders stand together at dawn, their bare feet pressed into the warm earth, their eyes fixed on the eastern horizon as the first light breaches the treetops. And they note not only that the sun rises, but where marking the point where its upper rim touches the jagged silhouette of a distant ridge, or where its rays strike the gnarled trunk of a lightning-struck Ceiba. And over weeks and months, they track the sun's slow migration north and south, recording its turning points not on parchment, but in muscle memory, in the placement of stones, the angle of staircases that will one day guide bare feet upward at the exact moment the light floods the central plaza on the equinox. This is not astronomy as calculation, but as embodiment. The body becomes the instrument, the plaza the dial, the temple the pointer. And when the sun's first beam strikes the center of the altar on the day of planting, the entire community feels it not as spectacle, but as confirmation, a quiet certainty that they are still in step with the great turning of the world. Life around these emerging centers shifts with remarkable subtlety. Paths that once wound loosely between homes are now bordered with low curbs of stacked stone, not to confine, but to channel rainwater toward communal gardens where maize, beans, and squash grow in expanding concentric rings, each crop placed not by chance, but by deep understanding of how their roots intertwine beneath the soil, how their leaves shade one another, how their needs complement rather than compete. Water management evolves from simple gourds to ceramic reservoirs lined with stucco, their interiors polished to a glassy smoothness that minimizes seepage and reflects the faces of those who draw from them, turning the daily act of collecting water into a moment of quiet self-recognition. Even waste is honored. The ash from ritual fires is saved for nixtamalizing maize and for whitewashing walls, giving them a pale, moon-like radiance. Broken pottery is crushed and mixed into new daub, so that every home contains the memory of those that came before. And the jungle, rather than retreating, moves in closer vines drape over the lower terraces, not as invaders, but as companions, their tendrils curling around stone edges with the same gentle insistence as fingers clasping a loved one's hand, while howler monkeys, undisturbed, continue to call from the canopy above, their voices echoing off the new stone surfaces and returning as layered harmonics, as though the city itself were learning to sing. At night, the transformation deepens. As the last workers step away from the stones and the fires and family hearths are banked for the night, priests ascend the rising platforms, not in procession, but one by one, their steps measured, their breath steady, until they reach the summit, where the air is cooler, thinner, and carries the scent of distant rain. Here, beneath a sky untouched by smoke or artificial light, the Milky Way stretches across the darkness, like a river of crushed pearl, so brilliant it casts faint shadows on the pale limestone, and the priests do not merely observe, they participate. They lie on their backs, their bodies aligned with the north-south axis of the platform, and let the stars move across their field of vision, memorizing not only the positions of planets, but their speeds, their colors, the subtle shifts in brightness that signal celestial events long before they become visible to the untrained eye. Venus, Chak'ik, the great star, is watched with particular care, not as a point of light, but as a presence, its 584-day cycle mirrored in the rhythm of planting and ceremony, its disappearance into the sun's glare marking a time of introspection, its reappearance at dawn heralding renewal. And these observations are not kept secret, but woven into the fabric of daily life. When a child asks why the maize is planted now and not later, the answer is not because the soil is warm, but because Chak'ik has returned to guide us, linking the intimate act of sowing seeds to the vast architecture of the cosmos. Artisans respond to this expanding world by deepening their craft not in complexity, but in resonance. Potters shape vessels whose curves echo the arc of the horizon at dawn, whose rims are flared just enough to catch the first light and hold it like liquid gold. Weavers introduce new motifs into their textiles, not abstract patterns, but representations of the world as they understand it, step triangles for the rising platforms, interlocking spirals for the Ceiba's roots and the path of Venus across the sky, concentric circles for the sun and the milpa, so that to wear such a cloth is to carry the cosmos on one's shoulders. And carvers, working with stone and bone, begin to etch subtle symbols into tools and ritual objects. Not glyphs yet, but proto-signs. A spiral for breath, KO. A dot within a circle for the seed. A wavy line for water, each one a seed of writing, planted in clay and stone long before it blooms into script. And when these objects are used, in grinding maize, in drawing water, in lighting the hearth, they become conduits of memory, silent teachers that pass knowledge from hand to hand, generation to generation, without a single word. Trade intensifies not through markets, but through reciprocity networks that span hundreds of miles. Obsidian from the highlands, its edges sharper than any flint, arrives in pouches lined with soft deer hide, each blade wrapped separately to prevent shipping, and in return, coastal communities receive dried ramon seeds, prized not only for their protein, but for their use in ceremonial drinks that induce visions of the ancestors. Jade, carried from the Motagua River Valley, is not valued for its rarity, but for its color, the deep green that mirrors the heart of the Ceiba leaf, the flash of a quetzal's wing, the still water of a cenote at noon. And when it is carved into pendants or ear spools, it is shaped not into rigid forms, but into flowing curves that echo the human face, the maize cob, the spiral shell, so that the wearer carries not ornament, but identity. These exchanges are never hurried goods are offered, accepted and reciprocated over days, woven into shared meals, songs, and storytelling sessions, so that the objects themselves become carriers of relationship. Each obsidian blade holding the memory of the hands that knapped it, each jade bead echoing the sound of distant rivers in the mind of its new keeper. Most profoundly, time itself begins to be felt differently, not as a linear march, but as a spiral that returns upon itself, each turn deepening the understanding of what came before. The rising platforms create new horizons' edges, against which the sun's movement can be measured with greater precision. And priests, standing on these elevated surfaces at dawn, begin to note not just that the sun rises, but where it rises, tracking its slow migration north and south along the eastern ridge over the course of the year. And from these observations, the first calendrical concepts emerge not as abstract numbers, but as embodied knowledge. The number of days between the sun rising over the Ceiba's tallest branch and over the jagged rock to the north becomes a unit of time. The interval between the first flowering of the chaca and the arrival of the rains becomes a season, and the reappearance of Venus in the morning sky after its 8-day disappearance becomes a sacred interval, a heartbeat of the cosmos that priests mark not with ink, but with memory, repetition, and song. This is the birth of Maya timekeeping, not in observatories, but in the body's alignment with earth and sky, in the daily act of standing still and noticing. And always, the jungle remains, not as a backdrop, but as a collaborator. Parrots nest in the crevices of unfinished walls, their bright feathers flashing like embers against the pale stone. Bats roost in the shaded undersides of platforms, emerging at dusk to feed on the insects drawn to the city's warmth. And at dawn, the calls of howler monkeys echo across the plazas, mingling with the early sounds of daily life, not as intrusion, but as integration, a reminder that the city is not separate from the forest, but a concentration of it, a place where human life gathers to listen more deeply, to remember more faithfully, and to respond more wisely to the great slow breath of the world. By the time the evening fires are lit and the last artisans lay down their tools, the transformation is undeniable. What were once villages are now cities in embryo, not defined by size alone, but by density of meaning, by the layering of gesture upon gesture, memory upon memory, until the land itself begins to hum with the quiet electricity of shared intention. And as the stars shimmer above, reflecting in the polished surfaces of the new stone, you can feel it, the first quiet certainty that something enduring is being built here, not in haste, but in harmony, stone by stone, story by story, breath by breath, beneath the watchful branches of the Ceiba. As the cities of the Maya world rise with grace and intention, The jungle continues to breathe around them with the same steady rhythm it has held for millennia. Yet within the expanding plazas, homes, and ceremonial spaces, a new kind of stillness begins to settle, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness that comes just before a decision must be made. A quiet tension that lives not in shouts, but in the pause between breaths, in the way a hand hesitates before placing the next stone, in the slight tightening of the shoulders, as a farmer walks farther than he did last season to reach his fields. These are not conflicts of war or conquest, but of balance, of how to grow without exhausting, how to remember without resisting change, how to honor the past while making space for what the future gently asks for. And in this delicate negotiation between continuity and adaptation, a Maya civilization reveals its deepest strength, not in avoiding difficulty, but in meeting it with patience, observation, and an unwavering commitment to community as the vessel that carries both joy and sorrow. The first signs of strain appear in the land itself, not as catastrophe, but as subtle shifts that demand attention, the kind of changes only those who live with their hands in the soil can detect. Fields that once yielded abundant harvests after a single planting cycle now require a second round of tilling. Their dark, fertile topsoil thinning, where the roots of maize and beans have drawn deeply year after year, and farmers begin to notice that the rains, once reliably arriving with the flowering of the chaka tree, now come a few days later, their intensity uneven, sometimes gentle and soaking, other times fierce and erosive, washing away precious nutrients before the plants can absorb them. In response, families gather at dusk not to lament, but to adapt grandfather's share, how their ancestors rotated fields in 3-year cycles, leaving one fallow while planting the others, trusting that the earth, like a person, needs time to rest and replenish. Mothers experiment with interplanting wild greens like chaya and chipolin among the maize, not only for nutrition, but because their deeper roots help stabilize the soil. And children are taught to walk the edges of the fields, not with idle steps, but with purpose, collecting fallen branches to build low terraces that slow runoff and guide water back into the earth, so that what is lost in one place returns in another, a lesson not in control, but in reciprocity, in learning to move with the land rather than against it. Within the cities, leadership evolves under the weight of growing responsibility. Where once a small council of elders could guide a village through consensus formed in the shade of a Ceiba, now decisions must account for hundreds, then thousands of lives. And the quiet art of listening becomes more essential than the force of command. Priests who once interpreted the movements of Venus for planting cycles now find themselves asked to read deeper meanings in the same sky. Does the planet's unusually bright appearance before dawn signal renewal or a warning? Does its prolonged absence in the evening sky reflect a pause in the cosmic rhythm or a call for introspection? These questions are not debated in raised voices, but in long silences, in the shared passing of a gourd of balchi, in the slow tracing of fingers over carved stele, where earlier generations recorded their own moments of uncertainty. When disagreements arise over whether to expand a temple platform toward the east, where the sunrise aligns with a sacred ridge, or toward the west, where the community's water source lies, the resolution is not imposed but woven. Builders adjust the angle incrementally, testing the alignment over weeks, observing how the light falls at dawn and dusk, listening to how the wind moves across the unfinished surface, until a form emerges that satisfies both sky and earth, both memory and need. And in this way, conflict becomes not a rupture, but a refinement, a deepening of understanding through collaborative attention. Beyond the city walls, the relationships between neighboring centers begin to shift with the quiet inevitability of rivers changing course. Paths once used only for the exchange of seeds, shells, and stories now carry envoys who walk with measured steps and speak with careful phrasing, their words chosen not to provoke, but to preserve. One city, flourishing in a valley, rich with limestone and access to coastal trade, begins to send more frequent offerings, not only jade and cacao, but finely carved steely, depicting its rulers in poses of mediation, not dominance, as if to say we remember the old ways, even as we grow. Another, struggling with drier conditions in the highlands, responds not with resentment, but with a gift of drought-resistant maize strains and a delegation of elders who offer to share knowledge of terraced farming. Their arrival marked not by fanfare, but by the quiet placement of a single obsidian blade at the base of the receiving city's Ceiba, an ancient gesture, meaning we come in clarity, with open hands. These exchanges do not erase difference, but transform it into dialogue. And though pride and concern for autonomy linger beneath the surface, they are held in check by a deeper belief that no city, no matter how radiant its temples, can thrive in isolation, and that the strength of the Maya world lies not in uniformity, but in the resilient network of trust that spans valleys, rivers, and mountain passes, each node distinct, yet bound by shared language, shared stars, and shared reverence for the cycles that sustain all life. Emotional tensions also rise within families and individuals, not as rebellion, but as quiet questioning, especially among the young, whose eyes have grown accustomed to the sight of towering platforms and the sound of ceremonial drums echoing across plazas, and who begin to wonder whether the old ways of planting by the moon and building by hand will be enough for the world they are inheriting. A daughter watches her mother grind maize on the same metate her grandmother used, her hands moving in the same circular rhythm, and she feels both love and a faint, unnamed restlessness. What if the motion could be eased? What if water could be drawn, not by gourd and rope, but by a channel that carries it closer to the homes? She does not voice these thoughts as criticism, but as curiosity, and when she finally shares them with her mother one evening, the older woman does not dismiss her. Instead, she places a hand over her daughter's and says, "Show me," and together they sketch a shallow trench in the dirt, tracing how rainwater from the plaza's eastern slope might be guided toward the communal gardens, their fingers working side by side, the old knowledge and the new idea meeting not as opposites, but as partners in a longer story. Elsewhere, a young man who has traveled to a distant city returns with stories of a new technique for reinforcing walls with woven guano ribs, and though his uncle initially resists our walls have stood for generations, he agrees to test the method on a small storage shed. And when the first heavy rains come and the shed remains dry while older structures leak, he nods slowly and says, "Teach me, not as surrender, but as continuity, as the quiet courage to let wisdom evolve." Even the spiritual life of the community deepens in response to these subtle pressures. Priests begin to hold longer vigils atop the temple platforms, not only to read the stars, but to listen to the wind through the Ceiba's leaves, to the distant calls of howler monkeys, to the silence between heartbeats. And in these moments of expanded attention, they begin to reinterpret old rituals, not to discard them, but to renew their meaning. Where once offerings of maize and copal were placed solely at the base of the Ceiba, now small bowls of collected rainwater are added, a gesture acknowledging the changing relationship with the sky. Where once ceremonies focused on the abundance of the harvest, new elements are woven in songs of gratitude for resilience, dances that mimic the slow growth of roots in dry soil, prayers that honor not only the gods of rain and sun, but the spirit of the earth itself, Cab, whose patience sustains all. These are not reforms imposed from above, but adaptations that rise from below, like sap moving through a tree, carrying the nutrients of experience to the newest leaves, ensuring that the living tradition remains rooted in truth, even as the world around it shifts. The jungle, as always, bears witness not as judge, but as companion, and it too responds to the changing balance. Vines that once draped gently over temple steps now grow more vigorously, their tendrils curling with quiet insistence around carved stones, as if reminding the builders that time belongs to no one. Fig trees send roots into the cracks between platform stones, widening them gently year by year, not to destroy, but to integrate, to show that stone and soil are not enemies, but phases of the same story. And at dawn, when the first light touches the city, the calls of howler monkeys echo not against the stone, but with it their deep, resonant cries bouncing off the smooth limestone and returning as layered harmonics, as though the architecture itself were learning to sing in the language of the forest. This is the Maya world at its most profound, not in the absence of conflict, but in its transformation of tension into texture, of pressure into pattern, of uncertainty into deeper attunement. Every challenge met becomes a lesson embodied, in the curve of a new terrace, in the angle of a realigned staircase, in the quiet passing of knowledge from elder to youth, in the shared decision to wait one more day before harvesting, trusting that the rain will come. By the time the evening fires are lit, and the scent of atoll rises from hearths across the city, the sense of strain has not disappeared, but it has been held contained within the wider vessel of community, ritual, and memory, and in that holding, it loses its sharpness, becoming instead a source of strength, like the tension in a bowstring that allows the arrow to fly true. Families sit together not in denial of difficulty, but in acknowledgement of it, sharing food, stories, and the simple comfort of proximity. Children fall asleep to the sound of their parents' low voices discussing the day's work, not with anxiety, but with the calm determination of those who know that no season lasts forever, and that even drought yields to rain, even silence yields to song, even conflict, when met with patience and presence, yields to understanding. And as the stars emerge one by one above the Ceiba's branches, shimmering with the same steady light that guided the first villagers centuries before, you can feel it, the quiet certainty that this civilization is not fragile, but flexible, not rigid, but resilient, not built to resist change, but to move with it, like a tree in the wind, bending deeply, yet never breaking, its roots holding fast, its branches reaching always toward the light. As the Maya world moves deeper into its era of flourishing cities and expanding knowledge, a quiet transformation begins to settle over the land, not as rupture, but as recalibration, like the subtle shift in a river's current when the rains change their pattern. And in this stillness, a single night emerges that will be remembered not for its drama, but for its depth. A night when the sky seems to hold its breath, and the earth listens with unusual attention. A night when the weight of many small decisions converges into a moment of collective clarity. It is not marked by thunder or eclipse, but by stillness, the kind of silence that comes just before a seed breaks open beneath the soil. And though no one knows it yet, this night will become a hinge in time, the point around which a civilization turns not away from its past, but more deeply into its meaning. The day leading into this night is unremarkable in its surface rhythm. Farmers return from the fields with baskets of maize and beans, their shoulders dusted with pollen and fine limestone powder kicked up from the paths. Artisans finish carving a new stela for the central plaza, its surface still damp with the water used to polish the glyphs, the scent of wet stone mingling with the faint green aroma of crushed copal leaves pressed into the mortar for binding. Children chase fireflies near the edge of the settlement, their laughter soft and unhurried, blending with the low hum of conversation from elders seated in the shade of the Ceiba. Yet beneath this familiar cadence, a quiet tension hums. Priests have been gathering more frequently atop the tallest temple platform, their robes brushing the worn limestone steps as they ascend at dusk, not in procession, but one by one, as though drawn by a shared sense that something in the celestial rhythm has shifted, something too subtle for words, but unmistakable in the body. A slight delay in Venus's reappearance after its celestial disappearance, a faint reddish tinge to the moon during its last full phase, a pattern of stars near the southern horizon that no longer aligns with the carvings on the oldest altar stones. As the sun sets, painting the western sky in layers of amber, rose, and deep violet, the community prepares for the night, not with ceremony, but with care. Fires and family hearths are banked to glowing embers, not extinguished, for warmth and continuity. Clay bowls of water are placed near doorways, their surfaces still, reflecting the first stars as they appear. And on the central plaza, a circle of small braziers is lit, not with roaring flames, but with slow-burning copal resin placed atop beds of ash, so that the smoke rises in steady, silver spirals, cool to the touch, fragrant and resinous, carrying the quiet intention of offering without demand. The air cools gradually, the humidity dropping just enough to make the limestone platforms feel slightly dry beneath bare feet. And as the last light fades, the jungle does not erupt into noise, but deepens into resonance. The croak of frogs from the bayou becomes more rhythmic, the rustle of leaves more pronounced, the distant call of a porrick bird repeating its two-note phrase with metronomic precision, as though the forest itself were holding time for what is about to unfold. The priests gather at the summit of the main temple, not by decree, but by convergence, each one arriving after completing their evening duties, their steps measured, their breath steady, their bodies already attuned to the long hours of observation that have shaped their lives. They do not sit in hierarchy, but in a loose semicircle facing east, their backs to the city, their eyes to the horizon, where the first stars have begun to pierce the deepening blue. One of them, an elder whose hands bear the calluses of decades spent tracing glyphs on bark paper and stone, unrolls a folded codex, not a new text, but an old one, its pages made of hewn bark, smoothed with gourd shells and coated with fine lime plaster, its surface covered in glyphs that record the movements of Venus, the length of solar years, and the intervals between eclipses observed by his grandfather's grandfather. He does not read aloud. Instead, he places the codex on the cool stone and traces a line with his fingertip, the record of the last 8 appearances of Chakiki, the great star, and then, slowly, adds a new mark, slightly offset from the expected position, a tiny deviation that would be invisible to the untrained eye, but to those gathered, speaks volumes. The sky is not broken, but breathing, and its rhythm is changing in ways that require not correction, but reinterpretation. Meanwhile, in the plaza below, families gather not out of obligation, but out of quiet anticipation. Mothers wrap sleeping children in cotton cloths dyed with annatto, their warmth offsetting the cool night air. Fathers bring woven mats and low stools, arranging them in concentric rings around the central fire pit, not in rigid formation, but with the organic flow of a milpa field, each space left open just enough for movement, for sharing, for the passing of a gourd of atoll from hand to hand. Elders sit near the inner circle, their presence not commanding, but anchoring, like the Ceiba's roots holding the earth in place. And young people linger at the edges, not excluded, but observing, absorbing, their eyes moving between the sky above and the faces of those who have spent lifetimes learning to read it. No one speaks loudly. Voices are low, rhythmic, often overlapping in the way of shared memory. Do you remember the dry season when the rains came late, and we planted the second maize after the stars aligned with the jagged rock? Yes, and the harvest was smaller, but sweeter, as if the earth had concentrated its gift. These are not debates, but weavings, threads of experience pulled together into a stronger fabric of understanding. At the center of the plaza, a small altar has been prepared, not newly built, but refreshed, its surface swept clean of dust, its edges smoothed with damp clay, its top adorned not with grand offerings, but with humble ones, a cluster of white maize kernels, still moist from the day's harvest. A sprig of chaka blossoms, their white petals open only at night. A single conch shell, its spiral echoing the Milky Way above. And a shallow bowl of collected rainwater, clear and still, placed so that when the moon rises, its reflection will appear as a second sky within the vessel. These objects are not symbolic in the abstract sense. They are relational. The maize represents sustenance and continuity. The chaka marks the passage of time through its flowering cycle. The conch carries the memory of the coast, of trade, of connection beyond the forest. And the water holds the sky, making the celestial tangible, drinkable, knowable. To stand before this altar is not to worship from a distance, but to participate in a dialogue that has been unfolding for centuries. As the moon rises full, luminous, slightly copper-tinged at the edges, the priests descend from the temple, not with pronouncements, but with invitation. The eldest among them steps into the circle of light cast by the braziers and begins to speak, not in the formal register of ritual, but in the quiet cadence of storytelling, his voice low and steady, like the sound of water moving over smooth stones. He does not speak of omens or warnings. He speaks of recalibration, how the ancestors, too, had faced moments when the sky seemed to shift, and how they responded not with fear, but with deeper observation, with patience, with the courage to adjust the old calendars without discarding their wisdom. He recalls how, generations ago, a prolonged dry season had led to the refinement of terrace farming, not as abandonment of tradition, but as its extension into new conditions. He reminds them that the Ceiba tree does not resist the wind, it bends, and in bending, finds greater strength. And as he speaks, his words are not met with silence, but with soft affirmations. Yes, I remember. We have done this before, a chorus of recognition that flows through the circle like breath. In response, the community begins to act not with urgency, but with intention. A group of builders, seated near the edge of the circle, rise quietly and walk to the unfinished eastern staircase of the temple, where the final course of stones has been waiting for alignment. They do not rush. They bring only water, string, and a plumb stone, a smooth river rock tied to a cord, and by the light of torches held steady by apprentices. They remeasure the angle of the steps, not against the old markers, but against the current position of Orion's belt as it rises above the ridge, adjusting the placement of the topmost stone by less than the width of a finger, a change imperceptible to the casual eye, but profound in its meaning. We are still listening, and we are still learning. Nearby, a group of scribes unrolls fresh bark paper and begins to sketch not new glyphs, but annotations beside the old ones, small marks indicating observed deviations, questions, possibilities, turning the codex not into a fixed record, but into a living document, a conversation across time. Families, too, respond in their own ways. A mother adjusts the timing of her planting calendar, noting that the first flowering of the chaka now coincides with Venus's reappearance, not its disappearance, and she shares this with her daughter as they grind maize together, their hands moving in the same circular rhythm, their voices low, their knowledge passing not as command, but as collaboration. A trader, preparing to leave for a distant city in the morning, adds a new note to his memory string's knotted chords, used to record distances and exchanges, not just the standard route, but an alternate path that avoids a drying riverbed, a small adaptation that may one day become the main road. And a young man who has been apprenticing with the stone carvers asks his master if they might try a new technique for polishing glyphs, not to replace the old, but to test whether a finer grit of limestone dust, mixed with cactus sap instead of water, might make the carvings more resistant to rain, a question met not with dismissal, but with show me. And together they prepare a small test panel, their hands working side by side under the moonlight. The night deepens, and the air grows cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth from the bayou and the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine climbing the temple walls. The fireflies that danced earlier now rest in the grass, their light extinguished, and in their place the stars shine with startling clarity, the Milky Way, a river of crushed pearl, Venus a steady beacon low in the east, the Pleiades a tight cluster of diamond points just above the Ceiba's highest branch. And as people begin to disperse, returning to their homes with quiet steps, there is no sense of resolution, but of continuity. The turning point is not a single decision, but a shared commitment to remain awake, to keep watching, to hold the old wisdom gently while making space for the new. It is not a rejection of the past, but a reaffirmation of its deepest principle, that to live in harmony with the world is not to impose order upon it, but to move with its rhythms, even when they change. By the time the last brazier's embers glow faintly in the plaza, and the only sound is the soft drip of condensation. From the Ceiba's leaves, the transformation is complete not in stone, but in spirit. The city rests with a quiet dignity, its structures unchanged in form, but renewed in meaning, its people carrying within them a subtle shift in orientation, as though they have all, without speaking, turned slightly toward a new horizon, not with fear, but with the calm determination of those who know that the earth has weathered countless changes, and that the Maya, too, are part of that enduring cycle. The sacred night does not end with fanfare. It dissolves into dawn, as all nights do, and as the first light touches the newly aligned temple steps, catching the edge of the adjusted stone in a thin line of gold, you can feel it, the quiet certainty that this civilization is not fragile, but flexible, not rigid, but resilient, not built to resist change, but to move with it, like a tree in the wind, bending deeply, yet never breaking, its roots holding fast, its branches reaching always toward the light. As the echoes of the sacred night settle into memory, and the city returns to its daily rhythm, a new kind of quiet begins to move through the Maya world, not the silence of absence, but the silence of reflection, like the stillness that follows a deep breath held too long and finally released. And in this calm, the civilization begins to absorb the weight of what has transpired, not as failure or triumph, but as teaching, as the kind of understanding that only emerges when a community has faced uncertainty together and chosen, again and again, to remain rooted in care rather than fear. The stones of the temples do not change, yet they feel different beneath bare feet warmer, perhaps, or more solid, as though they, too, have absorbed the night's intention and now stand not only as monuments, but as witnesses, repositories of a collective decision to listen, to adapt, and to continue. This is the moment when loss and learning intertwine so deeply that they become indistinguishable, like the roots of two trees growing side by side until their fibers merge beneath the soil. And what emerges is not nostalgia for what was, but wisdom for what must be. The first signs of this transformation appear not in grand declarations, but in the smallest gestures of daily life. A farmer who once planted his entire field in a single maize variety now divides it into thirds 2 rows of the old strain, one of the drought-resistant seeds brought by travelers from the highlands, his hands moving with the same steady rhythm as before, but his eyes watch the sky more closely, noting not only the position of Venus, but the color of the clouds at dawn, the behavior of ants along the field's edge, the way the leaves curl when the air grows dry. He does not speak of risk, but of diversity, a word not yet formed in sound, but already alive in practice. And when his daughter asks why he changes the pattern, he shows her, not with words, but by placing a handful of each seed type in her palm, the smooth white kernels of the ancestral strain, the smaller, harder ones of the new, and says, each has its time. The earth remembers both. Nearby, a family that once drew water from a single well now supplements it with a shallow catchment basin lined with stucco, built at the base of their home's thatch roof, its surface tilted just enough to guide runoff into a ceramic reservoir. The basin is not new technology, but renewed attention and idea borrowed from a coastal trader, adapted to limestone terrain, and accepted not as replacement, but as addition, a quiet acknowledgement that wisdom flows in many directions, like water seeking its course. Within the ceremonial spaces, the priests refine their rituals not by discarding the old, but by deepening its meaning. Where once offerings were placed only at dawn, now a second, smaller one is made at dusk, not with maize, but with rainwater collected in a polished conch shell, its surface still, reflecting the first stars as they appear. A gesture that says we honor both light and shadow, both growth and rest. Where once the great star, Chak Ek, was celebrated only at its reappearance in the morning sky, now its disappearance into the sun's glare is marked with a night of vigil not as mourning, but as meditation, a time for listening to the silence between heartbeats, for tracing the glyphs on bark paper by firelight, for asking questions that have no immediate answers, but deserve to be held gently in the mind. And when the stelae are carved to record this period, the glyphs do not speak of crisis or correction, but of Aegeis Limel co-breathing with the earth, of Sak, the sacred sequence of cycles that include contraction as well as expansion, hardship as well as abundance. And in these carvings, the faces of rulers are shown not in rigid profile, but in three-quarter view, their eyes slightly downcast, their hands resting on stone tablets, as though in dialogue with the ancestors, rather than command over the living. Artisans respond to this shift in tone by turning their craft inward. Potters begin to shape vessels with thicker walls and narrower necks, not for beauty alone, but for function, to minimize evaporation during drier months. And to these practical forms, they add subtle decoration lines that mimic the path of underground rivers, spirals that echo the Ceiba's roots and the Milky Way, dots arranged in clusters that mirror the Pleiades, so that even the most ordinary object becomes a mnemonic, a silent teacher that carries cosmology into the home. Weavers introduced new patterns into their textiles, interlocking triangles that represent terraced fields, wavy lines for the shifting rivers, concentric circles for the cycles of planting and fallow. And when a young woman wraps herself in such a cloth before dawn, she feels not only its warmth, but its meaning, the weight of generations who learned to read the land as a text and write their responses in thread and clay. And carvers, working in the shaded courtyards of temple complexes, begin to depict scenes not only of ceremony and rulership, but of quiet resilience, elders teaching children to read the stars, families rebuilding a storage shed after a storm, a group of women grinding maize together as the first light touches the eastern ridge, images that do not glorify power, but honor continuity, that say this too is sacred. Even the landscape bears witness to this deepening. Where a river once flooded predictably each year, depositing rich silt on the fields, it now shifts its course after heavy rains, leaving behind a crescent of dry, cracked earth where maize once grew tall. Instead of abandoning the land, families gather to build low stone terraces along the new bank, not to fight the water, but to guide it, slowing its flow so that sediment settles in the channels they create. And within 2 seasons, new soil forms, dark and rich, and the first shoots of Ramon and Shia appear, not the crops of old, but nourishment nonetheless. Fig trees, sensing the disturbance, send roots into the abandoned fields, their broad leaves shading the soil, their fruit feeding birds and bats. And in time, the community begins to harvest the seeds, roasting them for flour, grinding them for ceremonial drinks, turning loss into provision with the same quiet patience that shaped their earliest milpas. The jungle does not reclaim these spaces with force, but with invitation, offering new relationships where old ones have changed. And the people respond not with resistance, but with observation, with gratitude, with the courage to let go of what no longer serves life while holding fast to what does. Leadership, too, evolves in response to these layered lessons. Councils no longer meet only in the temple's shadow, but rotate among the city's neighborhoods, sitting on low stone benches in family courtyards, in the shade of market stalls, at the edge of the bayou, so that decisions about water, planting, and ceremony are made not in abstraction, but in proximity to the lives they affect. When a neighboring city sends word of hardship, a dry season stretching into its 3rd month, the response is not debate, but action. A caravan is prepared not with fanfare, but with care, carrying not only maize and seeds, but a delegation of elders who bring knowledge of terrace farming and rainwater catchment. Their arrival marked not by speeches, but by the quiet placement of a single obsidian blade at the base of the receiving city Ceiba, the ancient gesture meaning we come in clarity with open hands. And when a young apprentice questions why they share so freely, an elder replies, because the earth does not hoard its rain, because the Ceiba does not keep its shade for itself, because what we give returns not as the same thing, but as trust, as memory, as the certainty that when our time of need comes, we will not be alone. Most profoundly, Time itself is re-understood, not as a line moving forward, but as a spiral that returns upon itself, each turn deepening rather than repeating. The calendars are not revised, but annotated new glyphs added beside the old, small marks indicating observed deviations in Venus's cycle, notes on the timing of rains, questions posed in the margins of bark paper codices, turning the record not into a fixed law, but into a living conversation across generations. Children are still taught the old planting songs, but now they learn variations verses for dry years, for late rains, for years when the stars seem to shift, and as they sing, their voices rise not in unison, but in harmony, a sound that mirrors the world they are inheriting, complex, adaptive, resilient. And when an elder dies, the mourning is not rushed, but held for 13 days, the sacred count of the upper world, during which the community gathers each evening to share stories, not only of the departed, but of the lessons they carried, the seeds they planted, the songs they sang, so that grief becomes a vessel for transmission, a way of ensuring that what was learned does not vanish with the body, but flows onward like water through limestone. By the time the evening fires are lit, and the scent of a toll rises from hearths across the city, the sense of loss has not disappeared, but it has been held contained within the wider vessel of community, ritual and memory, and in that holding, it loses its sharpness, becoming instead a source of strength, like the tension in a bowstring that allows the arrow to fly true. Families sit together not in denial of difficulty, but in acknowledgement of it, sharing food, stories, and the simple comfort of proximity. Children fall asleep to the sound of their parents' low voices discussing the day's work, not with anxiety, but with the calm determination of those who know that no season lasts forever, and that even drought yields to rain, even silence yields to song, even loss, when met with patience and presence, yields to understanding. And as the stars emerge one by one above the Ceiba's branches, shimmering with the same steady light that guided the first villagers centuries before, you can feel it, the quiet certainty that this civilization is not fragile, but flexible, not rigid, but resilient, not built to resist change, but to move with it, like a tree in the wind, bending deeply, yet never breaking, its roots holding fast, its branches reaching always toward the light. The stones of the temples stand unchanged, yet they hold more now, not only the memory of construction, but of recalibration, not only the weight of ambition, but the depth of humility, not only the imprint of hands that lifted them, but the breath of those who leaned against them and whispered, "We are still learning." And in the silence between the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a night bird, you can hear it, the soft, steady pulse of a people who have faced the unknown not with fear, but with open hands, who have learned that the greatest legacy is not what endures unchanged, but what endures because it can change, like the Ceiba, like the river, like the stars, like life itself. As the Maya world moves beyond the quiet reckonings of loss and adaptation, a new kind of energy begins to gather, not the sharp spark of ambition, but the steady warmth of understanding, like sunlight pooling in the curve of a stone basin after days of cloud. And in this gentle light, the civilization begins to shape its legacy not as a monument to power, but as a vessel for continuity, a way of ensuring that what has been learned, felt, and lived does not vanish with the passing of a generation, but flows forward like water through limestone, finding new channels, nourishing new roots, sustaining life long after the hands that dug the first furrow have returned to the earth. This is the moment when legacy ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes something tangible, held in the curve of a glyph, the alignment of a staircase, the rhythm of a song passed from grandmother to granddaughter. And what rises is not a single temple, but a civilization's quiet declaration that memory is not passive. It is built, it is carried, it is lived. The cities themselves reflect this deepening sense of purpose. Where once platforms rose to mark sacred space, now they expand into interconnected complexes plazas flanked by low galleries, causeways lined with stelae, temple pyramids that do not stand in isolation, but in dialogue with one another, their staircases aligned so that on the equinox, the shadow of one falls precisely across the threshold of another, a silent conversation written in light and stone. These structures are not built quickly, but with the patience of those who understand that true endurance is not in speed, but in integration. Each block of limestone is tested against its neighbor, rotated until it settles with a soft click that signals harmony rather than force, and the surfaces are smoothed, not with metal tools, but with river stones and water, rubbed in slow circles until the stone takes on a pale, luminous sheen that catches the low light of dawn like the inside of a seashell. When the sun reaches its zenith, this surface reflects the light not harshly, but gently, casting a warm glow onto the faces of those who gather below, as though the architecture itself were participating in the act of blessing, affirming that what is built with care becomes a living part of the world, not an imposition upon it. Knowledge, too, begins to take physical form, not as rigid doctrine, but as living record. In shaded courtyards, where the air is cool and the light dappled by Ceiba leaves, scribes sit cross-legged on woven mats, their backs straight, their hands steady, bending over sheets of humbark paper smoothed with gourd shells and coated with fine lime plaster. They dip reed brushes into ink made from soot and water, and with movements practiced since childhood, they trace glyphs, not merely symbols, but bodies of meaning, a dot within a circle for the seed, a spiral for breath, KO, a wavy line for water, a jagged line for lightning, each one a node in a vast network of understanding that connects the human world to the rhythms of the earth and sky. These codices are not hidden away, but consulted openly. A farmer may ask a scribe to read the record of past rains before deciding when to plant. A priest may trace the path of Venus across decades of glyphs to refine the timing of a ceremony. A mother may bring her child to watch the scribe work, not to learn writing yet, but to absorb the reverence with which knowledge is handled, how the pages are turned with clean hands, how the ink is mixed with care, how silence is held not as emptiness, but as space for attention. In this way, literacy is not a privilege, but a shared practice, a thread woven through the fabric of daily life. Astronomy, refined through centuries of patient observation, becomes not only predictive but participatory. Priests no longer climb the temple platforms simply to record the positions of stars, but to align themselves with them, standing barefoot on the cool limestone as the first light of dawn touches the eastern horizon, their bodies becoming living instruments of measurement. They note not only that the sun rises, but where marking the point, where its upper rim touches the jagged silhouette of a distant ridge, or where its rays strike the gnarled trunk of a lightning-struck Ceiba, and over weeks and months, they track the sun's slow migration north and south, recording its turning points not in abstract numbers, but in the placement of stones, in the angle of staircases, in the orientation of doorways, so that the entire city becomes a calendar, readable by anyone who knows how to watch. When the sun's first beam strikes the center of the altar on the day of planting, the entire community feels it not as spectacle, but as confirmation, a quiet certainty that they are still in step with the great turning of the world. And this alignment is not imposed from above, but emerges from below, from generations of people who chose, again and again, to pay attention. Art flourishes not as decoration, but as mnemonic architecture, every object shaped with intention to carry meaning into the future. Potters carve vessels whose curves echo the arc of the horizon at dawn, whose rims are flared just enough to catch the first light and hold it like liquid gold, and whose surfaces are painted with scenes not of conquest, but of continuity. Elders teaching children to read the stars, families rebuilding a storage shed after a storm, a group of women grinding maize together as the first light touches the eastern ridge. Weavers introduce new patterns into their textiles, interlocking triangles for the rising platforms, wavy lines for the shifting rivers, concentric circles for the cycles of planting and fallow. And when a young woman wraps herself in such a cloth before dawn, She feels not only its warmth, but its meaning, the weight of generations who learned to read the land as a text and write their responses in thread and clay. Stone carvers, working in the shaded courtyards of temple complexes, depict rulers not in rigid profile, but in three-quarter view, their eyes slightly downcast, their hands resting on stone tablets, as though in dialogue with the ancestors rather than command over the living. And in the background of these carvings, they include details often overlooked: the texture of maize leaves, the curve of a grinding stone, the pattern of woven baskets, so that even the most ceremonial image carries the imprint of daily life, reminding all who see it that greatness is not separate from the ordinary, but grown from it, like maize from the earth. Trade evolves from exchange into reciprocity as ritual. Canoes glide along rivers that cut through the jungle, their hulls carved from single Ceiba trunks, their crews moving with the quiet confidence of those who know every bend and rapid. They carry cacao beans wrapped in banana leaves to prevent moisture, jade beads strung on cotton cords to avoid chipping, obsidian blades nestled in soft deer hide, and finely woven cotton cloth folded with care. But what they bring back is not only goods, but relationship. A trader from the highlands may return with drought-resistant maize strains and a delegation of elders who offer to share knowledge of terrace farming. A group from the coast may arrive with salt and conch shells and leave with stories of a new technique for reinforcing walls against hurricanes. These exchanges are never hurried goods, are offered, accepted, and reciprocated over days, woven into shared meals, songs, and storytelling sessions, so that the objects themselves become carriers of connection, each obsidian blade holding the memory of the hands that knapped it, each jade bead echoing the sound of distant rivers in the mind of its new keeper. And when a traveler departs, they are not simply sent off, but accompanied in memory. The host walks with them to the edge of the settlement, then places a small, unmarked stone on the trail as they leave a silent marker that says you were here. Your words mattered, you are remembered, and if that stone remains in place for a full moon, it is covered with soil, and a ramon seed is planted beside it, so that the memory grows into a tree, its roots intertwining with the path, its fruit feeding future travelers. Even the natural world participates in this era of flourishing. The jungle, rather than retreating, moves in closer vines drape over the lower terraces, not as invaders, but as companions, their tendrils curling around stone edges with the same gentle insistence as fingers clasping a loved one's hand, while howler monkeys, undisturbed, continue to call from the canopy above, their voices echoing off the new stone surfaces and returning as layered harmonics, as though the city itself were learning to sing. Rivers reflect the shapes of buildings rising along their banks, carrying the shimmering image of a civilization deeply connected to its surroundings. And at dawn, the calls of birds, parrots, motmots, trogons blend with the early sounds of daily life, not as intrusion, but as integration, a reminder that the city is not separate from the forest, but a concentration of it, a place where human life gathers to listen more deeply, to remember more faithfully, and to respond more wisely to the great, slow breath of the world. Most profoundly, time itself is re-understood, not as a line moving forward, but as a spiral that returns upon itself, each turn deepening rather than repeating. The calendars are not revised, but annotated new glyphs added beside the old, small marks indicating observed deviations in Venus's cycle, notes on the timing of rains, questions posed in the margins of bark paper codices, turning the record not into a fixed law, but into a living conversation across generations. Children are still taught the old planting songs, but now they learn variations verses for dry years, for late rains, for years when the stars seem to shift, and as they sing, their voices rise not in unison, but in harmony, a sound that mirrors the world they are inheriting, complex, adaptive, resilient. And when an elder dies, the mourning is not rushed, but held for 13 days, the sacred count of the upper world, during which the community gathers each evening to share stories, not only of the departed, but of the lessons they carried, the seeds they planted, the songs they sang, so that grief becomes a vessel for transmission, a way of ensuring that what was learned does not vanish with the body, but flows onward like water through limestone. By the time the evening fires are lit, and the scent of atoll rises from hearths across the city, the sense of purpose is palpable, not as pride, but as gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement that what has been built is not theirs to keep, but theirs to pass on. Families sit together, not in celebration of achievement, but in recognition of responsibility, sharing food, stories, and the simple comfort of proximity. Children fall asleep to the sound of their parents' low voices discussing the day's work, not with urgency, but with the calm determination of those who know that no season lasts forever, and that even drought yields to rain, even silence yields to song, even loss, when met with patience and presence, yields to understanding. And as the stars emerge one by one above the Ceiba's branches, shimmering with the same steady light that guided the first villagers centuries before, you can feel it, the quiet certainty that this civilization is not fragile, but flexible, not rigid, but resilient, not built to resist change, but to move with it, like a tree in the wind, bending deeply, yet never breaking, its roots holding fast, its branches reaching always toward the light. The legacy that rises like a temple is not made of stone alone. It is made of memory, of attention, of the daily choice to listen, to adapt, to care. It is in the hands of the potter shaping a bowl whose curve echoes the horizon, in the voice of the grandmother teaching her granddaughter the planting song, in the quiet placement of a stone on a path to mark a traveler's passage, in the way the sun's light catches the edge of a newly aligned staircase and turns it, for a moment, into gold. It is not a monument to the past, but a bridge to the future, built not with haste, but with humility, not with force, but with faith in the earth, in the stars, in the enduring strength of a people who have learned, again and again, that to belong is not to dominate, but to respond. As the centuries move forward, with the same unhurried grace that once guided the planting of maize and the alignment of temples with the rising sun, the great Maya cities begin to undergo a transformation that is neither sudden nor violent, but deeply tender, like the slow closing of a flower at dusk, a process not of collapse, but of release, in which life does not flee the stone, but chooses, with quiet intention, to follow new paths where water flows more steadily, where soil retains its richness, and where the rhythm of daily existence can once again breathe without strain. This is not abandonment as rupture, but as recalibration, a recognition that to honor the earth is sometimes to step back, to return a space to the forest so that memory may rest undisturbed. And in this gentle withdrawal, the cities do not vanish, they settle, like a body lying down to rest after long labor, their stone bones sinking slowly into the embrace of the land that first gave them form. The first signs of this transition appear not in silence, but in subtle shifts of rhythm. The sound of grinding maize grows less frequent in certain courtyards. The daily rhythm of footsteps along the causeway softens, and the smoke that once rose in steady spirals from hearths across the plazas now appears only in scattered clusters, like stars emerging one by one in the evening sky. Families do not leave all at once. Departure is a slow unfolding. Guided by careful observation and shared decision, elders gather in the shade of the Ceiba to discuss not fear, but feasibility. The river no longer reaches the lower fields. The soil near the western ridge has thinned, despite our terraces. The rains come later each year, and the dry season stretches like a held breath. These are not complaints, but assessments, spoken in calm voices, with hands resting on knees, with eyes that have watched the land for decades and know its language better than their own names. And when the decision is made to move toward the highlands, where springs bubble year-round, or to the coast, where trade winds bring moisture and connection, the process is not chaotic, but ceremonial. Homes are not stripped bare, but left with care, clay vessels placed upright on shelves, grinding stones set beside the hearth, woven mats folded and tucked beneath sleeping platforms, not as if expecting return, but as if offering the space back to the earth with gratitude, like a guest leaving a borrowed home cleaner than they found it. As the human presence recedes, the jungle responds not with conquest, but with reunion. Vines do not invade the temples. They return, their tendrils curling around carved lintels with the same gentle insistence as fingers clasping a loved one's hand, their growth guided by light and moisture, not by aggression. The roots of strangler figs, sensing the cool microclimate within abandoned courtyards, send fine filaments into the cracks between limestone blocks, not to shatter, but to embrace, their expansion slow and patient, widening fissures over decades rather than days, until a single root may cradle an entire staircase, holding it in place even as it reclaims it. Moss spreads across sunken plazas not as a blanket of erasure, but as a softening, a living membrane that cushions the stone from rain, that traps moisture in the dry season, that turns sharp edges into gentle curves, as though the forest were tending to the city's wounds with the same care a mother tends to a child's scrape. And in the silence that deepens, the sounds do not disappear, they transform. The echo of footsteps on temple steps gives way to the soft plink of dew falling from broad leaves onto worn stone. The murmur of conversation in the plaza becomes the layered chorus of frogs after rain, the distant call of howler monkeys, the rustle of peccaries rooting in the leaf litter near what was once a market stall. Even the wind changes its voice, no longer whistling through open doorways, but sighing through corridors draped in vines, its passage slowed, its tone lower, more resonant, as if the city itself were learning to breathe in a new rhythm. Within the temples, time gathers like a quiet mist. Dust settles not as decay, but as preservation, a fine layer of pollen, ash, and soil that cushions glyphs from erosion, that fills the hollows of carved faces with softness, that turns sharp lines into gentle contours. Altars that once held offerings of maize, copal, and conch shells now collect rainwater in their shallow basins, becoming miniature ecosystems where tiny orchids take root, where damselflies lay their eggs, where the reflection of the sky becomes the only offering left pure, unbroken, eternal. In the corridors of royal palaces, sunlight filters through gaps in the thatch roofs, long since surrendered to decay, casting slow-moving pools of gold across floors where rulers once walked, their feet bare on cool stone, their thoughts turned to stars and seasons. And in the deepest chambers, those once reserved for scribes and priests, the bark paper codices have long since returned to the earth, their lime plaster surfaces dissolved by humidity, their glyphs faded into the soil, yet their knowledge lives on not in the physical object, but in the lineage of memory carried by those who departed, in the planting songs still sung in distant valleys, in the way a grandmother teaches her granddaughter to read the position of Venus before dawn, her voice low and steady, her hands tracing the same path in the air that her ancestors traced on paper. The loss is real, but it is not absolute. What vanishes in one form reappears in another, like water evaporating from a basin only to return as rain. Travelers who pass through these quiet cities centuries later do not experience them as ruins, but as thresholds, places where the veil between past and present grows thin, and where listening becomes a form of seeing. They walk along causeways now softened by leaf litter, their feet sinking slightly with each step, and as they move, they feel not emptiness, but presence, the weight of intention in every curve of a staircase, the care in every fitted stone, the alignment of every doorway with the eastern horizon. They pause at the base of a stela, whose glyphs have been softened by centuries of rain, and though they cannot read the script, they feel its meaning in the posture of the carved figure, a ruler standing not in triumph, but in contemplation, his hands resting on a tablet, his gaze slightly lowered, as if listening to the earth. They find fragments of pottery not as debris, but as gift shards of bowls whose curves still echo the horizon at dawn, whose pigments hold the memory of annatto and iron-rich clay, whose surfaces bear the faint impressions of the potter's thumb. a signature pressed into clay over 1,000 years ago, and still legible to those who know how to look. And when they sit on a low bench in what was once a communal plaza, they do not feel alone, they feel accompanied, as though the air itself holds the resonance of countless gatherings, of shared meals, of songs sung under moonlight, of decisions made in consensus, of grief held in circles, of joy celebrated with drums and dance. The city does not speak in words, but in atmosphere, in the way the light falls at a certain hour, in the scent of wet stone after rain, in the coolness that lingers in shaded courtyards long after noon. Even the passage of time itself is reimagined here, not as a line moving forward toward oblivion, but as a spiral that returns upon itself, each turn deepening rather than erasing. The Maya understanding of time was never linear. It was cyclical, layered, recursive, and in this abandonment, that truth becomes visible. The same forces that built the city now unbuild it with equal reverence. Water dissolves mortar as gently as it once mixed it. Roots lift stones as patiently as hands once placed them. Vines cover walls with the same care that plaster once smoothed them. And in this reciprocity, there is no tragedy, only continuity, a recognition that all things have their season of rising and their season of returning, just as maize sprouts, grows, bears fruit, and falls to nourish the next generation. The temples do not fail. They fulfill their purpose, not by enduring unchanged, but by becoming part of a larger story, one in which stone and soil, human and jungle, memory and forgetting are not opposites, but phases of a single breathing whole. By the time the moon rises over the canopy, and its light filters through the leaves to touch the summit of a half-reclaimed pyramid, the city rests with a quiet dignity that feels sacred, not sorrowful. The silence is not empty, but full, like the space between notes in a song where meaning gathers and deepens. Fireflies drift between the trees, their brief glimmers mirroring the stars above, as if the earth and the sky were speaking the same language in pulses of light. And in this stillness, you can feel it, the gentle certainty that what was built with attention, with care, with love, cannot truly be lost. It may change form. It may sink into the earth. It may be embraced by vines and moss and roots, but its essence remains, held in the memory of the land, in the pulse of the people who carry its songs forward, in the way a child still grinds maize in a circular motion, her wrist angled just so, her breath steady, her hands moving in a rhythm, older than writing, older than cities, older than time, as we measure it, a rhythm that says we are still here, we remember, we continue. The abandoned cities do not haunt the landscape, they bless it, standing as quiet witnesses to a civilization that knew when to build, when to adapt, and when to let go, a people who understood that true legacy is not in what endures unchanged, but in what endures because it can change, like the Ceiba, like the river, like the stars, like life itself. As the centuries settle like soft dust over the stone steps of ancient temples, and the roots of the Ceiba tree continue their slow embrace of time, the Maya world does not fade into silence. It transforms, not as a memory lost, but as a presence that lingers in the texture of daily life, in the cadence of speech, in the way hands move through familiar tasks with the same rhythm that shaped clay and planted maize 1,000 years ago. This is not nostalgia, but continuity, a living thread that runs from the past into the present, not through monuments alone, but through the quiet persistence of language, ritual, and reverence for the earth, carried forward by people who have never stopped being Maya, even when the world outside tried to rename them, erase them, or forget them. In the highlands of Guatemala, in the villages nestled among pine-clad ridges and mist-laced valleys, a grandmother rises before dawn, not because an alarm calls her, but because her body remembers the rhythm of the day as it has been lived for generations. She walks barefoot across the packed earth floor of her home, her feet cool against the surface still holding the night's chill, and she kneels beside the hearth where embers from the previous evening still glow faintly beneath a layer of ash. With a pinch of dry grass and a gentle breath, not a forceful blow, but a gift of air, she coaxes the fire back to life, and as the first flames flicker upward, she places a clay komol over the heat and begins to shape small rounds of dough from nixtamalized maize, her fingers moving with the same circular pressure her mother taught her mother before her, stretching back through lifetimes. The scent that rises is not only of cooking tortillas, but of memory earthy, warm, ancient, and when her granddaughter stirs sleepily on her mat and asks, "Why do we always grind the maize with lime?" the elder does not recite chemistry, but tells a story, because long ago the gods showed us that hardness must be softened to become nourishment, just as sorrow must be held to become wisdom. And in that moment, the science of nixtamalization and the cosmology of transformation become one, passed not in lectures, but in the steam rising from a simple meal. Language, too, remains unbroken not as a relic preserved in museums, but as breath, as pulse, as the living voice of community. In homes across the Yucatan Peninsula, children speak Yucatec Maya not as a second tongue, but as their first, their words shaped by vowels that mimic the flow of rivers and consonants that echo the crackle of fire. They learn to count not only in numbers, but in kinship Kain for day, Hob for year, Winal for the 20-day month, but also Ko for breath, Kax for the wild forest, Kux for the sacred heart of things. And in these words, the worldview persists. Time is not abstract, but embodied. Nature is not resource, but relation. The sacred is not distant, but intimate, woven into the fabric of speech itself. When a young man courts a woman, he does not say "I love you," but may whisper Tan in Ko, "Your breath is my breath," a phrase that carries the weight of the Ceiba's roots, the spiral of Venus, the shared rhythm of grinding maize at dawn. And when elders gather in the plaza to discuss the coming rains, they do not speak of percentages or forecasts, but of Chak-e Kain, the days of the great star, and the position of Orion's belt over the eastern ridge. Their conversation a continuation of the same dialogue that guided priests atop temple platforms centuries ago. Ritual endures not as performance, but as participation ceremonies, held not to reenact the past, but to renew the present. In the highlands of Chiapas, a community gathers at the base of a ceiba tree, whose trunk bears the faint scars of offerings made decades before, and they prepare not with fanfare, but with care. A gourd of balch-fermented bark and honey is passed from hand to hand, its taste bitter and sweet, like life itself. Copal resin is placed on the embers, its smoke rising in silver spirals that carry prayers not to distant gods, but to Kux Kai, Kux Kab, the sacred heart of sky, the sacred heart of earth, a recognition that divinity is not above or beyond, but within, pulsing in the same rhythm as the human heart. The shaman, or AJQIJ, does not stand apart, but sits among them, his voice low and steady, as he recounts the story of the hero twins not as myth, but as instruction. How to face deception with clarity, how to turn loss into strategy, how to honor the ancestors without being bound by them. And when the moon rises, full and copper-tinged, the people do not watch from a distance. They dance, their feet bare on the earth, their movements echoing the planting of seeds, the grinding of maize, the ascent of priests toward the stars, each step a reaffirmation. We are still here. We remember. We continue. Even the land bears witness to this living legacy. In the milpa fields that stretch across southern Mexico, farmers still plant the sacred triad maize, beans, squash not, because it is tradition, but because it works, because the roots of the beans fix nitrogen in the soil, because the broad leaves of the squash shade the earth and retain moisture, because the maize offers structure and sustenance, and because this kinship agriculture reflects a deeper truth. Survival is not domination, but reciprocity. When drought threatens, they do not reach first for chemicals. but for memory-rotating fields, building terraces, interplanting wild greens like chaya and chipolin practices refined over centuries, now validated by modern agroecology as models of resilience. And when the first rains come, they do not celebrate with fireworks, but with quiet gratitude, placing a handful of white maize at the base of the Ceiba, not as sacrifice, but as reciprocity, a gesture that says we take and we return. Art, too, remains a vessel of continuity. In backyards shaded by mango trees, weavers sit at wooden looms passed down through generations, their hands moving with the same rhythm that shaped textiles in ancient cities, their fingers selecting threads dyed with indigo, anato, and cochineal, not for novelty, but for meaning. The blue of the sky at dawn, the red of the Ceiba's heartwood, the deep purple of night-blooming flowers, and the patterns they create zigzags for lightning and rivers, concentric circles for the sun and the milpa, interlocking spirals for the Ceiba's roots and the Milky Way, are not decorative, but didactic, each textile a map of the cosmos worn on the body, a silent teacher that carries cosmology into the home. Potter-shaped vessels whose curves echo the horizon at dawn, whose rims are flared just enough to catch the first light. And when a mother serves a tole to her child in such a bowl, the drinker's lips touch the rim where the potter's thumb pressed, creating a chain of care that spans centuries. And in the hands of contemporary Maya sculptors, ancient glyphs reappear not as replicas, but as evolution, carved into stone, wood, or clay alongside images of modern life. A child holding a book, a woman voting, a farmer tending a solar-powered pump roof. That tradition is not frozen, but flowing, adapting without losing its roots. Education, too, is being reclaimed not as replacement, but as integration. In bilingual schools across Guatemala and Mexico, children learn mathematics not only through numbers, but through the Maya vigesimal system, the counting by 20s that appears in the Tzolk'in calendar, solving problems using seeds, stones, and chords, just as their ancestors did. They study astronomy not only through telescopes, but by lying on their backs at night, tracing the path of Venus across the sky, learning that Chaki is not just a planet, but a guide, a teacher, a mirror of human cycles of disappearance and return. And when they write, they do not choose between Spanish and Maya, they move between them, their notebooks filled with glyphs sketched beside poems, their voices rising in song that blends ancient melodies with modern harmonies, their creativity a living bridge between worlds. Even the great cities, long reclaimed by the jungle, are not ruins to these communities, but relatives' places to visit, to listen, to remember. Families travel to Tikal, Palenque, or Calakmul not as tourists, but as pilgrims, their children walking barefoot on the same limestone steps their ancestors climbed, their hands brushing the same glyphs, their eyes lifting to the same sky. At dawn, when the mist rises from the plazas and the first light touches the temple summits, they do not take selfies, they sit in silence, feeling the weight of time, the presence of those who came before. And sometimes, a shaman will light copal at the base of a stela, not to perform, but to reconnect, his voice rising in a low chant that carries the same cadence as the wind through the Ceiba's leaves, the same resonance as the howler monkeys calling from the canopy, the same frequency as the human heartbeat ko breath, the pulse that binds all life. And in the quiet moments, when a mother braids her daughter's hair with ribbons dyed the color of anato, when a fisherman checks his nets at dusk and notes the position of Orion, when an elder teaches a grandchild to read the clouds before planting, you can feel it. The Maya civilization did not end. It transformed, it adapted. It endured not in stone alone, but in skin, in soil, in the shared warmth of hands passing a gourd of water from one to another in the dark. The Ceiba tree still stands, not only in the jungle, but in the heart of every Maya person who carries its roots within them, deep, resilient, reaching toward the light even in the hardest seasons. Its branches hold the stars, its trunk holds the present, its roots hold the past, not as separate layers, but as one living whole. And as the evening fire is lit in homes across the highlands and lowlands, and the scent of atole rises into the cooling air, and children fall asleep to the sound of their parents' low voices, telling stories of the hero twins, the maize god, the Ceiba and the stars, you can feel it too. The echo is not fading. It is growing stronger. It is not behind us. It is all around us. It is beneath our feet. It is in our breath. You have walked with them through time, not as observer, but as guest, as listener, as witness, and now, as the night deepens and the stars shimmer above the canopy, you carry that echo with you, too, not as history, but as possibility, not as loss, but as light. As our journey through the Maya world draws to its gentle close, allow yourself to remain for a few more breaths in the quiet space we have shared beneath the canopy of memory and stars where the air still carries the faint warmth of the day, as last light and the soft scent of damp earth, crushed leaves and the lingering trace of copal smoke rising from an ember that has not yet surrendered to the night. You are still standing beneath the Ceiba tree, not as an observer, but as a guest who has been welcomed into a sacred circle of time, where past and present meet not in collision, but in convergence, like two rivers joining without losing their names. The branches above you stretch skyward with quiet dignity, their leaves rustling in a breeze, so gentle it feels like the exhale of the earth itself, and their roots, hidden beneath the soil, hold centuries of stories not as weight, but as nourishment, feeding the life that continues to rise around them. The fire that flickered softly at the beginning of our journey has now settled into a bed of glowing embers, pulsing faintly like a resting heartbeat, and in its warmth you can feel the echo of countless others' fires lit at dawn to rekindle the day. Fires kept alive through the night as a covenant with continuity, fires around which elders spoke and children listened, fires that carried prayers upward in spirals of smoke and brought communities closer in shared light. This fire, too, will fade, but not into nothingness. It will return to ash, to soil, to seed, to steam rising from new rain, to the breath of a potter shaping clay, to the warmth in a mother's hands as she wraps her child in a cotton cloth dyed with annatto. Nothing here is lost. Everything transforms. Around you, the jungle settles into its own rhythm of rest. The distant call of a porrick bird repeats its two-note phrase with metronomic calm. The croak of frogs from the bayou deepens into a steady chorus, and the rustle of leaves grows softer, as if the forest itself were lowering its voice to match yours. Even the stones of the temples, though distant in space and time, feel near in spirit, their surfaces still holding the memory of sunlight that cracks, sheltering moss and orchids, their staircases worn smooth by footsteps that walked with purpose, not haste. You do not need to see them to feel them. You carry them now in the way your breath has slowed, in the quiet attention you've given to this story, in the space you've made inside yourself for a civilization that chose, again and again, to listen before it built, to adapt before it resisted, to honor before it claimed. If you wish, share where in time or in the world you are listening from, not as obligation, but as offering, and I will hold your words gently, like seeds placed at the base of the Ceiba, trusting that they, too, will find their place in the unfolding. If you would like to return for another night's passage through the quiet streets of ancient Athens, the starlit canals of Tenochtitlan, the snow-dusted decks of the Carpathia, you are always welcome. I will be here, not to rush you forward, but to walk beside you, step by step, breath by breath, through the vast and tender archive of human experience. For now, let the jungle close its eyes. Let the last glow of the embers fade into darkness without fear. Let the Ceiba's roots hold the memory of this moment, just as they hold the memory of every dawn that has ever broken over its branches. Let your body grow heavier, your thoughts softer, your breath deeper, each inhale drawing in the calm of the forest, each exhale releasing what no longer serves you, like a leaf falling not in surrender, but in trust. The stars above remain steady, watching over the land with the same quiet gaze they have held for thousands of years, not as distant points of light, but as companions, as guides, as witnesses to every life that has ever looked up and whispered, "I am here. I remember. I am part of this." You, too, are part of this. Not because you learned names or dates, but because you listened not to a history of monuments, but to a story of hands. Hands grinding maize, hands shaping clay, hands planting seeds, hands lighting fires, hands holding children, hands tracing glyphs in mark paper, hands reaching out in trade, in grief, in joy. Those hands are still moving. They move in the highlands, in the lowlands, in the cities and the villages, in the classrooms and the fields, in the quiet moments before dawn, when a grandmother stirs a toll over a hearth, and her granddaughter asks, "Why do we always grind the maize with lime?" And the answer comes not as science, not as myth, but as truth, because hardness must be softened to become nourishment. Just as sorrow must be held to become wisdom, just as stories must be told to become memory, just as you must rest now to become ready. So let yourself drift. The night is calm. The earth is steady beneath you. The Ceiba holds the sky, and the Maya world alive, resilient, breathing rests gently in your heart. Sleep now. Let the dreams come.